Hello, everyone. Welcome to Or This. This is my Monday morning quarterbacking of the scriptures and the sermon for the previous Sunday. And this video is for Sunday, October 29th. That day is usually recognized in Lutheran and some other Protestant churches as Reformation Sunday. And there are certain texts that usually go with the commemoration of Reformation Sunday. However, I decided for that particular Sunday to go with the traditional texts that connect with the texts from the previous week, called the lectionary texts. And so the texts that we used for our worship this weekend were Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 through 12. The psalm was Psalm 90, verses 1 through 6 and 13 through 17. The second reading was 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And the gospel was Matthew 22, verses 34 through 46. Excuse me. The gospel for Matthew is a continuation of the previous Matthew Gospels passages from these past few weeks, where Jesus is talking to the religious leaders who are questioning him and getting kind of contentious in trying to trap Jesus in what he's saying. And I did preach on the gospel for this weekend, but what I wanted to talk about was the reading from Deuteronomy. Throughout this whole year, this whole summer and into the fall, we've been following this series of passages that started in Genesis and have run through the whole book, almost the whole book of Exodus. Of course, we've skipped over some passages, but for the most part, the story was following through the way the stories run from Genesis, where we started with the story of Abram, through Abram's family, Abraham, he became Abraham, Abraham's family, and the Genesis ended with the story of Joseph. Then we started Exodus, which started the story of the great and numerous descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These numerous descendants being in Egypt, but being enslaved, and them crying out to God, and God raising up the leader, whose name was Moses, to free God's people from slavery in Egypt and lead them to this promised land. So over the past few weeks, we've been hearing some of the different challenges that the people have met in the promised land and the ways in which Moses led them through it. The passage from Deuteronomy that we had in front of us this weekend then was basically the story of Moses' death. And Moses' death comes before before God's people are able to enter the promised land. Now, I think it's safe to say that there are probably people who were freed from slavery in Egypt who did not live to be able to enter the promised land. But it becomes a little bit poignant because of the role that Moses played, not only in speaking on God's behalf to challenge Pharaoh and help free God's people from slavery, but to help them escape the pursuing army of the Pharaoh and then lead them through this wilderness area, this very challenging time. And then to get on the brink of the promised land, Moses can even lay his eyes on the promised land. But God says, you will not enter the promised land. And so the story tells of Moses' death and the people mourning for Moses. And for me, and I mentioned this weekend before we read the story, excuse me, that this story of Moses helps us to reflect upon the ways in which there will be times when we put in effort to start some project or to start a relationship with some person, maybe in the church where we are maybe as a teacher teaching them, or just coming alongside them at a particular time in their lives to support them. But we might put in a lot of effort in those times, but there's no guarantee that we will get to see the result of those efforts. That's sometimes just the way life happens. We get to be a part of the person's journey and a part of ministering to them, but we may not get to see the fruit of our efforts, as you know, because we, for whatever reason, we're just not able to be there. And this is actually a good biblical example of that. Moses gave a lot. I can't even imagine the, he was timid at first and didn't want to have to speak in front of Pharaoh, and yet he goes up against him, and then leading these people through this wilderness land that has nothing to offer them. They just have to wander through it to get to the promised land. And Moses looks to God and trusts in God to help guide him and God's people through that place. And then to know that he did the job that God called him to do, but he just wouldn't be able to go on to see, to kind of see the next part of the story. I'm sure that some of us have had that kind of experience. I'm sure teachers and coaches know what that's like in particular. You get to come alongside children and youth at a particular time in their life, and you get to be part of their life for a moment, but then they move on to whatever they go on to do. And we may or may not get a chance to hear back from them. I know sometimes teachers do, coaches do hear back from their students, from the kids on their teams, to hear what ended up happening in their lives. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. But, and people in the medical field, the same thing. They might help a person at a particularly difficult time, obviously a health challenge, and they give them the best care they can in that moment, but then the person gets discharged to go on to the next phase of their healing, and the health professional hopes and prays that they go on to better health and to healing. So that's an important aspect of our faith lives that is difficult, but maybe it gives us a little bit of hope to say that it's okay when that happens. We don't have to see somebody through all the way to the very end, that maybe there is a time when our efforts and what we were best at doing comes to an end, and somebody else might take the next phase and help in that phase in better than we could in that phase. And so we just commend people or ministry or situation to God, and whoever will carry on the good work that we had the privilege to participate in. The other thing that this made me think of is there are a lot of changes happening in churches because there's a lot of changes happening in society. And as society changes, the way that we interact with or engage society is going to have to change. There's going to be certain things that have to always be the same. That is our faith in Christ and in God that is revealed in Christ. But there are going to be a lot of things that are going to change over time just because of the way the world around us changes. And sometimes ministries change, right? Sometimes a ministry comes to an end and new ministry comes about. And that can be difficult if we were involved and put a lot of time and effort into what used to be. And sometimes it's difficult to look at that new thing and feel good about it. For some people, that there might be a sense of like, oh, was ours not good enough for the, to keep going? But I think it's important for us to realize the same thing in church life as well. That sometimes the ministry or program or whatever it is that we are doing, it might come to an end, but that doesn't negate the good that it did when it existed. And just because something new comes along does not wipe out the benefits that came out of the previous thing that was done. It served its purpose. It served people. It inspired people. It helped people, whatever, when it existed. But if it comes to an end, if it ceases to exist, that doesn't mean there was anything wrong with it. It just means that maybe there is just a different approach that will better serve the people or situation today better than it would if we continued the previous way. And this helps us to look at things a little bit more fluidly. Like, just because something ends doesn't mean anything bad. It just means that it's time for something new. And we will see part of the picture sometimes, but God sees the whole picture, and that's all that matters. And then we just have to thank God for the opportunity that we are given in the moment to be able to do some good for someone or for some cause. And then see what new thing God has in store. So I'd be interested to hear some of your comments, thoughts. Please feel free to share them in the comments on Facebook or on YouTube. And thank you for watching. God bless.